Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. If we capture atmosphere in a landscape, it'll boost the appeal in practically every case. But it can be quite a rare occurrence, and it can also make critical exposure just a little more difficult to achieve. So this is one of those times where we can turn to automatic exposure bracketing. Now what we're viewing here is two similar scenes, and the author had 3 shots set up. These two are what the camera felt was the correct exposure. These two were taken with half the recommended exposure, and of course we hear that referred to as 1 stop under. And these two were taken with double the recommended exposure, and you've probably heard people say, I overexposed by 1 stop. In this instance, the exposure was just about right, because we could choose either of the green or yellow labelled images and we'd get pretty good results. But a slight tilt upwards or downwards of the camera lens could have upset the exposure to the point where we burn out wanted detail. By the way, coloured labels can easily be applied to one or many thumbnails via Control 6, 7, 8 and 9. What about the aperture used here when we look at that in conjunction with the shutter speed used? Given the focal length of the lens, f8 would have increased the depth of field, and there was plenty of scope within that shutter speed to allow that. Although the depth of field seems okay in these images, that might not always be the case, and I posed the question, did the author get lucky here in relation to front to back sharpness? So here we have two similar views to consider, but this one at the top does have that power pole which is quite dominant. I think that would need to be removed along with the power line. But also I think the gate forms a bit of a barrier to us viewing the entire scene. The images below I think appear much better, but we do still have a power cable to remove and that ugly red sign right in the middle of the frame. The main thing we need to do is to maximize the impact of the atmosphere. So let's open the image that was given half the recommended exposure into Adobe Camera Raw. Now with the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, normally I would go to the panel that I've currently got open, the optics, to correct for chromatic aberration and the lens profile corrections. But this image was shot using a Sony RX10 camera with a fixed lens, and as this little note says here, it's got a built-in lens profile that's already been applied, and we can click for more info and there we can see the information it's telling us. So we don't have to tick these boxes when we're using some cameras, but of course if we tick them anyway we wouldn't be doing any harm. So I'm going to go directly to my basic tab and we'll take a look at some corrections here. Now I have considered a crop with this image, but I've decided that I don't think it really requires one. So the next stage is to look at the colour balance. I'm going to pick up my white balance tool from the toolbox on the right. Where do we click? We're looking for a neutral tone. It doesn't really matter if you click on an area that's wrong, because sometimes the colours go a bit odd. Just click again in a more desirable location. And if we click into the tree there, that should be neutral. That looks a little better. It's warmed up the colours just a little bit, but that's all I think we need here. I think I'll go next to my clarity, because clarity adds mid-tone contrast. And before I look at the exposure, I think it may be best to add this first. So I'm going to add a fair amount. And that's made the atmosphere up on the top left even better. and I was going to go to my exposure and start to lift it a little bit, but to be honest, I think that's probably done all I want to do. I'm not sure I want to go any further. Everything looks pretty good. I'll test it though by just trying a bit more. Well, maybe. These are really small changes, aren't they? Now, I think I'll take a quick look at a little bit of vibrance, but I'm not too keen on the green in the foreground. I think that's a little bit distracting because it's so strong. So if I push up the vibrance, that's going to get even stronger. But maybe if I want a little more vibrance in most of the image, but not the foreground section here, then maybe I could deal with that using a graduated filter. If I pick up my graduated filter and just click up from the base, all I'm looking to do here perhaps is to take the saturation of the green off. And all I'm really trying to do is to force the attention over that bank and that wire fence into the scene beyond. Now, the only other weakness is the light tones at the top, so I think this is going to be pretty delicate because we want to try to enhance them, but what we don't want to do is to ruin the atmosphere which attracted us to the image in the first place. So I'm going to click at the top here and I'm going to drag down somewhere around there. Remember, you can move these pins around and rotate your graduated filter shape any way you like. And we can do that after we've applied the change, and don't forget to touch the V key. You can hide that selection. All I wanted to do here was maybe bring down the exposure at the top. I mean, I can go a long way and that's clearly too far. So we just want to come down until we get the maximum amount of impact, but without losing the atmosphere. If you look up at the top right, you'll notice that the histogram looks quite healthy now. I could increase the whites just a little bit, just to try it, because by doing that and maybe tweaking the blacks down a little bit, what I'm effectively doing is stretching the contrast a little bit. But you can see there's a little bit of clipping warning coming in right at the top left, but it's minuscule, caused by that little bit of whiteness, and I don't think we need to worry too much about it. But if you are concerned, then of course you would need to just back off a little bit from that white slider. Taking just a few seconds to evaluate the image, I'm just wondering if I should put another gradient up at the top left, just to hold that left corner in. After all, that's where most of the light's coming from. I'm going to go up to that point. I'm going to touch the V key because I want to click about there and drag down. I'm going to right click within the selection and reset all of the settings. Touch the V key again because all I want to do here is maybe just take the highlights down. Let's take a look at that. I don't want too much. I don't want to kill the atmosphere there. I think that's looking pretty good. I think what I'd like to do now is to open this up into Photoshop. Now I've got the Smart Object status set, but I'm not sure I really require it here, but let's open up the object into Photoshop. Now one of the first things I'd like to do here is to remove that power cable that's running right through the center of the image. To do that, I can apply a new blank layer. Now we can do that from down at the bottom right of the layers palette or the layers window on the right hand side. But a shortcut that I often use is Ctrl-Shift-N, and then the new layer box appears and I can just hit the enter key, and as you can see the new blank layer is now sitting above the image. Very quick and convenient. I'm going to have a go at getting rid of that power line using the spot healing brush, and having that new blank layer allows me to do any of the repairs on that layer, so there's no risk to the image. But I do need to make sure that I've got the sample all layers box ticked at the top of the screen. I need a brush of an appropriate size. I'm going to make my brush just a little bit bigger. I'm going to click right there on the left side, hold the Shift key and go right down to this side and click, and allow Photoshop to repair that in one go. Now, if I go here and turn that on and off, we can see where the problem areas are. There's a bit of a straight line here, and a little bit of one there, but I don't think anyone would notice that, but we would possibly notice that. It doesn't look completely unnatural, but the mere fact that we know it isn't a part of the scene, we'd need to do something about it. Now, sometimes when these things happen, I've found that if you do the repair a little bit at a time, you sometimes get a slightly better result. So why don't we just turn off what we've just done, hit that Control-Shift-N and enter again, and we'll have another go. But what we'll do here is I'll make my brush slightly smaller. I'll click and do down to this point. That looks okay. I'll click there and do down to that dark area, and that looks okay. Let's see if I can go way over to the right and come back to that point. And that looks okay too. So let's move from this point to this point and evaluate what we've done. That's fine. Now let's just try this little bit and this little bit, and I think we've got a better result. So let's just drop that in the bin. And if we're happy with our work, save this of course as a Photoshop file, but I think I'm ready to flatten the image to move on to the next stage. That next stage is to remove that red arrow sign right in the middle of the picture. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to pick up my, I think I'll pick up my polygonal lasso, and I just want to make a selection shape maybe around here. I'll take that down just above that wire, see if we can get away with that. Once I've got the selection in place, we'll go to Edit, Content Aware Fill. Remember, the left side is where we're doing the repair, or where we're taking the repair, and the right side is the result. Now you can see a pretty good result here straight away. Now, using this tool in the 2020 version of Photoshop over the last few weeks, I'm having difficulty bettering the result that I'm getting by just selecting the auto setting here. And as you can see with the image on the right, we've got a pretty good result here. So I'm going to output this to the current layer. I don't need a separate layer to do this repair. I'm just going to click OK and let Photoshop do that fix for me. Control D will remove the selection. Control 0 will fit the image on screen. Sometimes with landscapes and seascapes, I often make them a little more panoramic by increasing the width but without increasing the height. I think we may get a benefit here. So let's take a look at that by going up to the image menu. I'm going to choose image size. I'm going to unlink that little chain. I'm going to add about 500 pixels on the width. So I just need to adjust that 7000 to read 7500. And when I click OK, you can see we get just a little bit of a stretch, 250 pixels on the left and right. Photoshop does a tremendous job of this, just gives us that nicer panoramic view that we like to see with landscapes and seascapes. Now, how about a little bit of selective color? I'm going to go to my toolbox on the left and select amongst the dodge, the burn, and I may come back to these in a moment, but the sponge tool. I'm using a standard soft edge brush here. Looking up at the top of the screen, I want to set saturate as the option. And here I want to select a flow of probably no more than 10%. Now the area I'm looking to enhance, maybe I'll make my brush a little bigger, is this area in the center to the left, because this is the important area in the picture. So I'm just going to lift the tones and maybe the warm tones above that bank. But that's all I wanted to do, just a little bit of extra color there. Not a great deal, but it does attract us that way, which is the strongest part of the image. We could take a look at a little dodging of the highlights maybe. Now we've got the image almost complete. So if I select dodge, highlights from the top of the screen, and I'm going to keep my exposure very low at 5%. I can now sweep my brush over these areas just to lift this lightness in that atmosphere, just in strategic locations. We're all going to choose something slightly different here, but I'm reasonably happy with the result that I have. And finally, one of my old favorites, and that is to select the Lasso tool to create a vignette. I don't want to put too much darkness into the atmosphere at the top of the image, so I'm going to keep it fairly close up there, something like that. In fact, I don't think I've got that quite right, which happens. Control D will remove that. So I'll have another run at that, keeping it away from the right hand side a little more. Something like that. I'll click inside and move it a little bit to the right because we can move the selection. When I've got it in place where I think it's going to do its work best, I'm going to hit Control Shift I, which is the shortcut for going up to the select menu at the top of the screen and selecting inverse. But then if I go to select a mask here, I need the feather to be somewhere up around 450 pixels. And I'll click OK to output that to a selection. Once I've done that, I'm going to hide the selection with Control H, and we need the levels command. I'm going to bring that up with the shortcuts again, Control L, but you'll find these in your image menu at the top left of the screen. All I want to do here is a little tweak of the mid-tone slider to the right, just to keep our attention nicely in that part of the image where we want people to look. And if you're in doubt, just turn the preview on and off and you can see the sort of result that gives us. It's pretty impressive sometimes what a vignette can do. Not forgetting, of course, that we do have a hidden selection, but that's no problem if we've completed our work, because I think I'm ready to say this is done. So now we come to the fun part of the video where we can compare the image we began with from a Sony RX10 camera to the image we created. And it's only when we can see them before and after do we fully appreciate how we've enhanced the appeal of the image. It looked okay as a raw file, but it does look rather blue, green and cool. Here we've brought out the colours, the tonal range, and we've kept all that lovely atmosphere in the distance. I'll see you next time.